Richard Harris, the Irish actor famous for Camelot and the first Harry Potter films, passed away in 2002. He spent much of his later life in London but also owned a home in the Bahamas and occasionally stayed in Los Angeles. For this story, let's treat his house as if it remained in family hands for a while before being sold to outsiders and imagine what happened to the new owners. The Harris home, a Georgian-style townhouse tucked into a quiet corner of Kensington, London, was sold in the mid-2000s to an English-American couple, Martin and Claire Donovan. Both in their 40s, they were professionals, Martin a financial consultant, Claire a photographer who adored old architecture. The house seemed perfect. Wide sash windows, intricate plasterwork, and the sort of high ceilings that made every room echo with a faint dignity. They knew, of course, who had lived there. The estate agent even highlighted it, smiling as though Richard Harris's name was a selling point. To the Donovans, it was charming trivia. At first, the house seemed only full of character: the creak of stairwells, the draft along the corridor, the faint scent of old wood and pipe tobacco that lingered no matter how often they aired the rooms. But soon they began to notice details that unsettled them. Claire was the first to complain. She said the mirrors in the upstairs hall seemed colder than the rest of the house. Standing before them felt like stepping into a shaded corner. Once, while reviewing her digital photographs, she found blurred frames taken when she hadn't touched the camera, showing nothing but warped shapes in that same hall. Martin, more pragmatic, dismissed it until he began hearing the piano. The house came with an upright, long untuned and neglected. At odd hours, particularly near dusk, he swore he heard keys being pressed in soft, hesitant progressions. He checked always nothing, the cover shut, the keys yellowing in silence. By the end of their first year, they stopped telling friends about these things. Their guests sometimes laughed nervously when a window shut itself or a voice seemed to carry from another room. But the Donovans no longer found humor in it. The house had grown heavier around them. In the library, Harris's favorite room, lined with shelves of poetry and scripts he'd once read aloud to friends, Claire refused to enter alone. She claimed she could hear whispers, as if someone rehearsed lines just beyond earshot. Martin started sleeping in the downstairs guest room. He said he couldn't bear the sensation of being watched from the corner of the master bedroom. The house seemed to breathe around Martin and Claire as though its walls remembered more than plaster and paint should. By the second winter in Kensington, the Donovans had stopped inviting guests altogether. What once had been a proud purchase, a statement of success, now stood as a burden they carried alone. Claire spent more time in the mornings wandering through the narrow hallways with her camera, not to take photographs for her work, but as if to prove to herself that what she saw and felt could be captured. Yet when she reviewed the images on her laptop, they told a different story. Rooms appeared darker than she recalled, corners swallowed in shadow, and objects she was certain had been in one position were subtly shifted in the still frames. A book left closed on the table in the library was caught in an image lying open, its pages bent as if recently thumbed through. Martin, meanwhile, had taken to long absences from the house. He stayed late at his office, lingered in pubs after meetings, and when pressed by Claire, simply said the house had an atmosphere that weighed on him. One evening, though, he came home pale and trembling, his overcoat still buttoned. He told her he had heard someone call his name while unlocking the front door. The voice was sharp, theatrical, a tone of command that carried authority. He was certain it hadn't come from the street. It had come from inside the house. The most troubling change arrived quietly. Their sleep, once peaceful, began breaking apart into restless fragments. Claire often woke with the sense of someone standing near her side of the bed. She would keep her eyes shut, paralyzed by the thought of what she might see if she looked. Martin confessed, weeks later, that he had felt the mattress shift beneath an unseen weight in the dead of night, as though another body had lain down beside him. The piano, long silent when they had guests, returned to life in the early hours. At first it was no more than a note or two, struck hesitantly, like fingers testing whether the ivory keys still held sound. But soon it became more purposeful, the echo of a melody, an old standard, a song Harris himself was once known to sing at dinner parties when he'd had enough to drink. The tune would rise faintly through the floorboards, enough to make their skin prickle with recognition. Each time Martin forced himself downstairs to the parlor, the piano sat mute, the air still carrying the ghost of the notes. The library grew worse. Claire, once fascinated by its charm, now avoided it unless absolutely necessary. She said the air there was heavier, thick with something she could only describe as expectancy. Sometimes when she lingered by the door, she thought she could hear pages turning, though no one sat within. A faint smell of cigarettes, not her brand, not Martin's, drifted from the room in the evenings. Harris had been a heavy smoker, and the odor carried that same stale, lingering bite. More and more, the house pressed them toward silence. They found themselves whispering in the hallways, not wishing to disturb whatever lingered. Meals were eaten quickly, the clatter of cutlery against plates sounding too loud in the cavernous dining room. Lights were left on in corridors, but no bulb ever seemed bright enough. And always, in the edges of their vision, they both felt movement, a figure passing across the landing, a shadow bending at the corner of the library, a shape seated briefly in the chair by the window before vanishing when looked at directly. The Donovans began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. But selling a house like this was not so simple. Beyond the financial entanglements, there was the sense that leaving would not free them. Both felt, though they never admitted it out loud, that the house had already marked them. By the time spring arrived, the Donovans no longer thought of the house as simply home. It had become something layered, a place where the present existed but never fully displaced what had come before. Days seemed normal enough when the sun cut across the tall windows, spilling light onto the parquet floors and chasing shadows into the corners. But the evenings, those long, drawn-out London evenings where twilight lingered uncertainly, revealed the house for what it had become. Claire noticed it first in the way sound traveled. She would stand in the kitchen rinsing a glass, only to hear a footstep on the staircase above, distinct and deliberate, though Martin hadn't returned from work. The creak of the wood carried with such clarity that she would find herself holding her breath, straining for the second step that never came. When she climbed the stairs moments later, every door stood shut, the landing empty, the silence immense. Martin's unease grew sharper, almost brittle. He confessed that he could no longer pass the master bedroom without glancing inside, half expecting someone to be sitting at the vanity, reflected in the mirror. One night, returning from the guest room, he froze. The mirror above the fireplace caught his reflection, but there was a distortion, as if another face, older and rougher, hovered behind his shoulder, watching. He turned sharply, the room empty, the air heavy with the faint tang of whiskey. The library, once avoided, became impossible to ignore. Claire began finding objects rearranged within. Books taken from shelves and left on the desk, an old lamp cord unplugged, photographs they had stored in drawers placed neatly on top. At first she thought Martin was moving things in absent-mindedness, but his blank confusion convinced her otherwise. What unsettled her most was the choice of books. The same volumes appeared again and again, poetry collections, Yeats and Wilde, bound in cracked leather as though someone insisted they be read. The piano, too, developed a rhythm of its own. It no longer waited for midnight to stir. Sometimes in the afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the drawing-room curtains, a faint chord would roll across the air, the keys depressed with enough force to vibrate the wood. Once, while Claire crouched to adjust a loose floorboard nearby, a run of notes sounded directly above her head. She lifted her gaze to the keyboard and saw the dust lifting from the surface, disturbed by invisible fingers. Sleep became treacherous ground. Claire would wake with the sensation that the room had shifted in her absence, that while her eyes were closed, someone had walked its perimeter, brushing fingertips along the furniture, pausing by the door. Martin began keeping a light on, but even the soft glow of a lamp seemed inadequate. He told Claire in a cracked voice one morning that he had heard humming in the dark a man's voice, low and tuneful, the sort of humming that precedes words. He had lain still, unable to move, until the sound ceased with a sharp intake of breath, as though cut off mid-song. There were other intrusions, subtler but no less disturbing. A neighbor mentioned once, in passing, that she had seen lights on in the upper windows at odd hours, long after the Donovans had supposedly gone to bed. Delivery men sometimes paused on the street outside, glancing at the house with an expression Claire couldn't quite read. Not curiosity, not fear exactly, but something close to recognition. And once, when she returned from the market, fumbling with her keys, a man across the street tipped his hat at her and called out, "Lovely to see the Harris place alive again." His smile carried a strange weight, as though he knew more than he should. The Donovans tried to speak of leaving, but the words faltered in their mouths. Selling would require agents, surveys, strangers walking through every room, and they felt the house would not take kindly to that. Martin suggested they wait, that perhaps the disturbances would fade, that perhaps the house was only settling around them. Yet, in private moments, he admitted he felt watched in a way that was no longer passive. It was as if the presence that moved through the house was growing bolder, testing its reach, seeing how far it could press into their lives before they broke. And still, every evening, as dusk stretched long across Kensington, the house fell into its true rhythm. The faint scrape of chairs on wood, the whisper of pages turned, the distant echo of piano keys carrying a melody that belonged to another man, in another time unwilling to release his hold. The atmosphere in the Harris house thickened as the weeks passed, as if the very walls were inhaling and exhaling alongside Martin and Claire. Days were no longer measured by hours, but by the subtle shifts in the house's mood. Morning light felt safe, afternoon shadows pressed close, and nightfall was unbearable. Claire had taken to leaving her camera on, its lens pointed down hallways or toward mirrors, hoping to catch something she could not see with her eyes. She would return to the footage only to find frames disturbed by flickers of static, as though something had stepped between the lens and the air. Once, while reviewing a clip shot in the drawing room, she froze the screen. In the reflection of the piano's polished wood, faint but unmistakable, was the profile of a man. His jaw was set, his hair unkempt, and though the image bled into grain and blur, there was an expression on his face, an impatience, almost irritation, that made her slam the laptop shut. Martin, once skeptical, had begun to treat the house with an odd reverence, almost like a tenant sharing space with a landlord. He no longer whistled in the corridors, no longer slammed doors or tossed his coat on the chair in the hall. Each action was performed with restraint, as though he feared disturbing someone else's rhythm. Claire noticed how he would sometimes pause on the staircase, his hand clutching the railing, listening. When she asked what he heard, he only shook his head. But Claire knew. She had heard it too. Voices, not in conversation but in fragments, lines spoken with dramatic weight, as if rehearsed. Words in the dark, again no, again. Sometimes laughter, sharp and cutting, drifting from the library at midnight. The library had become the core of the disturbance. The air there carried a pressure, like walking underwater. Books no longer stayed where they were left. Entire rows shifted, as though some unseen reader had browsed during the night. Claire once entered to find 3 volumes stacked neatly on the desk, each open to passages underlined in pencil. The handwriting was jagged, forceful. She showed Martin, and together they checked the earlier owner's records. Those were Harris's books, his personal copies, his notes. One evening, unable to resist, Martin read one of the underlined passages aloud. The words echoed strangely, as though the room itself repeated them. A low vibration filled the air, subtle yet undeniable, and the lamp on the desk flickered. Claire grabbed his arm, begging him to stop. He did, but the silence that followed was not empty, it was charged, like the pause before an actor delivers his next line. Sleep, already fragile, fractured further. Claire found herself waking at the same time every night. 3:11. At first she thought it coincidence, but the pattern persisted. Each time, she woke with the sensation that someone stood just beyond the bed, their presence filling the room though no shape could be seen. Martin began keeping a glass of whiskey by his bedside, drinking it down before sleep in hopes of dulling the dread. But even intoxication could not shield him. One morning, he told Claire that in the moments between waking and sleep, he had felt the edge of the mattress sink under a heavy weight, followed by the faintest whisper of breath against his ear. They tried bringing life into the house, inviting friends to dinner, hoping laughter and conversation might dissolve the gloom. Yet every attempt ended the same way. Guests left early, unsettled by something they could not quite name. One couple admitted, embarrassed, that they had heard someone singing upstairs, though they knew the Donovans were the only people in the house. Another friend claimed she had seen smoke curling from the library doorway, though when they rushed to check, the room was empty, the air clean and cold. Outside, neighbors had grown oddly attentive. More than once, Claire noticed a passerby pausing to stare at the house with a kind of nostalgic recognition, as though they remembered it from a different era. One elderly man even stopped Martin in the street, telling him, "He's not the sort to leave quietly, you know. That house will never be yours. It will always be his." The words stayed with Martin, gnawing at him in silence. And still the piano played. Always the same tune, halting at first, then flowing into melody, as if someone were practicing after years away from the instrument. A voice sometimes accompanied it, not singing, but humming, deep and resonant. The notes carried through the house in waves, seeping into walls, into dreams, until the Donovans could no longer tell where their unease ended and the house itself began. The decision to leave came not with a single event, but with the slow accumulation of many, the kind of erosion that grinds people down until they no longer recognize themselves. By the third year in the house, Martin and Claire were shadows of the couple who had once celebrated signing the deed. Their laughter was gone, their conversations reduced to murmurs. The house had consumed the cadence of their lives, dictating their movements, their silences, even their sleep. The breaking point came on a rain-heavy evening in late October. The Donovans had retreated early to the drawing room, choosing the softer glow of the fireplace over the cavernous dark that pressed against the windows. They spoke little, the air thick with the smell of damp wood. Then, as if in response to the silence, the piano began to play. Not a hesitant chord, not a ghostly fragment this time, it was deliberate. A full melody spilled into the room, confident and strong. The keys struck with an energy that reverberated through the floorboards. It was the same old tune, one Harris had once sung among friends, but now it carried weight, insistence. Martin stood, pale, his eyes fixed on the instrument, though no one sat at the bench. Claire clutched his arm, whispering his name, but he shook her off and stepped closer. He called out, voice trembling yet firm, "What do you want from us?" The piano ceased at once. The sudden silence was so profound it made the fire crackle louder, each pop of the wood a jolt. Then came the reply, not words at first, but the unmistakable sound of a man clearing his throat, preparing to speak. When the voice arrived, it was everywhere at once, deep and commanding, "You don't belong here." The lights flickered. In the reflection of the piano's varnished surface, Claire saw him not fully, but enough. A man seated as if ready to perform, his face stern, his eyes set on them with unflinching intensity. Richard Harris, or what remained of him, anchored to the place where he had lived, laughed, rehearsed and raged. Claire screamed, dragging Martin backward, and together they stumbled toward the hall. But the house resisted. Doors that should have opened stuck in their frames. The air thickened with the smell of cigarettes and whiskey, so strong it burned their throats. From the library came the sound of pages tearing, books flung from shelves. Lines of poetry bellowed aloud in a voice that rose and cracked with emotion. They fled into the street, the front door slamming shut behind them with such force that the windows rattled. Rain drenched them, but they stood there, trembling, unable to move farther. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, but none stepped out. It was as though the entire street already knew. The Donovans never returned. In the weeks that followed, movers arrived to collect their belongings under Claire's supervision, while Martin refused to set foot inside again. They sold the house quietly, the estate agent avoiding mention of its history this time, presenting it instead as a period townhouse with remarkable character. For years afterward, Claire admitted she dreamed of the house. In those dreams, the piano always played. She would wander through corridors heavy with smoke, hear lines of poetry recited in that booming voice, feel the weight of someone watching from the landing above. Martin, for his part, rarely spoke of it, though when pressed he would say only, "It wasn't our house. It was his." and it always will be. And so the Harris home still stands, its windows gazing across Kensington streets, its walls holding onto echoes. New owners come, drawn by the elegance, the history, the address. They repaint, redecorate, rearrange. But eventually, they all begin to notice the same things. The smell of smoke that never leaves, the piano that plays when no one touches it, the sense of a man still inhabiting every room. For Richard Harris, larger than life in his years and unwilling to fade in death, never truly left his house. He lingers, rehearsing lines for an audience unseen, unwilling to let the curtain fall. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.